All right. I'm going to try not to cry. I wrote a poem for Jordan. The teacher gave the student ideas. Then he made them his own. But ideas cannot be owned. He did not have the ideas had him. And they took him farther than he ever thought possible, across boundaries rarely crossed, past rivers of doubt and mountains of fear. He felt their jagged edges, wiped their dust from his brow, left his blood in their soil. He was offered a house in the suburbs of long-term security, but the ideas offered something greater, not just the meaning of life, which he thought he sought, but the experience of being alive. The student came back to tell the teacher his ideas, and the teacher made them his own. But ideas cannot be owned. He did not have the ideas had him, and they took him farther than he ever thought possible. And now, many years after they first met, they wonder, who was the student and who was the teacher? My student, my teacher, Jordan Thomas.
A year ago, I was living in the inner city of Kansas City, about 5 blocks east of Prospect Avenue, if you know where that's at. And a couple weeks after I was living there, this apartment complex just down the road from me caught on fire and burned. And it's very likely that this building was set on fire by either someone who I knew or by someone who knew people I knew. And you have to understand that some people in this neighborhood would catch buildings on fire, and then they would go raid the buildings in the aftermath of the blaze and strip the scrap metal and the copper wiring from the building and sell it for pennies per pound at the local scrapyard. Now, I had arrived in the inner city after about 7 months of bare-bones travel through Latin America. And my first day walking down the street, I just laughed to myself. Like, this is the hood. They have running water and paved streets. How bad could it be? It took several months for the essence of the place to really sink into me. This place was poor, but it was a different kind of poor. It was the kind of poor that exists in places where personal worth and social worth are directly correlated to material worth. And when every day you go walking down cracked sidewalks, beside boarded windows, under razor wire fence, and all you have to do is look up to see the wealthy, opulent skyline rising above you, a constant reminder of your social worth. Now, when I would step onto the block where I was living, however, the feeling changed. It was subtle. You could start hearing crickets, you'd smell plants, and then you'd start noticing weird things like asparagus growing beside the sidewalk and a patch of strawberries next to the bus stop. And then you round the corner, and all of a sudden you'd be in a community garden. So I'd come back from South America to explore some questions that had been raised inside of me about how local food systems could impact local communities. And I'd heard of an urban farm being built in the inner city, so I decided to come home to join the effort and see what was happening. And what was happening was kind of hard to put your finger on, but the facts exist that crime rate had actually dropped in this neighborhood 20% since this project had started. Now, you could say that it's because of the raised beds, the greenhouse they were building, or the community garden, or you could say what you want about it, but what I think is because it was giving the community a sense of pride and social worth that didn't exist in the broader society before that. Now, there are distinct parallels here with a Mayan family that I lived with in Guatemala, and that they had very little materially, but they had a very strong sense of community. They had low crime rates, they had healthy crops, and they had good food on the table. I had met this Mayan family while taking a year off of college. I had some questions that just couldn't really be answered by filling in Scantron bubbles. So I had dropped out of college. I had sold my car, bought a bicycle, recruited my brother and my best friend, and we had started pedaling south together on our bicycles. We camped. We cooked our own food. We ate a lot of rice and beans, lentils. And we cleaned ourselves in rivers and lakes and streams. And we carried on this way through the deserts of South Texas, along the coasts of Mexico, into the highland mountains of Mexico, through the deserts of Puebla, the cloud forests of Oaxaca, and through the state of Chiapas. We had a lot of adventures, obviously, that I'm not going to get into now. But by the time I got to Guatemala, I was alone. And I met this Mayan family who took me in, and I stayed with them for about a month, and I grew very close to them. And when it came time for me to leave, they decided to conduct a traditional shamanic religious ceremony to coincide with the day of my departure. So what they did is sorry, I'm going to take a drink of water real quick. Okay, there we go. They arranged 20 bricks to point in the 4 cardinal directions to facilitate the flow of ancestral energy. And the ancestral energy was flowing around the center where they had a fire, which was symbolic of the soul or the self, the Mayan identity. And what was particularly important during the ceremony was that into the fire they were placing corn, maize. And they were placing heirloom seeds into the corn, seeds that they'd selected by hand and which have been passed on from generation to generation, continuing an integral part of the Mayan self and identity that was there tied to the land. Now, after this ceremony, they held a community meeting in which they were discussing how they were going to combat legislation that was attempting to bring Terminator seeds from foreign corporations into Guatemala. What I realized was that for them, this wasn't about hippie Whole Foods or some non-GMO diet trend. This was survival. This was religious. Their way of life and their identity was under threat. I had this new question forming inside of me. How are native land-based people dealing with an encroaching market economy? And that landed me here, in the highland deserts of New Mexico, in the passenger seat of my girlfriend's car. We had arrived here in a small southern Colorado mountain town called Taos, having absolutely no idea where we were going to stay for the summer. We had a small research grant that provided enough money for food and transportation, but not rent. So we found this meadow outside of town and pitched a tent and made a little home for the summer before we set about learning from the local Taos Pueblo community. Now, the Taos Pueblo are unique for many reasons. They're one of the only Native American groups that was never moved off of their land. Just down the road from us was the longest continuously inhabited area in the United States. It had been occupied for upwards of 1,000 years. And they were sedentary agricultural people. So like the Mayans, a substantial amount of their identity and their self and their religion was tied to the land and the crops. Now, another important thing about them is that they managed to retain an incredible amount of their native identity in spite of overwhelming odds. So what we wanted to see is how local agriculture and the Taos Pueblo was sort of facilitating this cultural survival, and how the Taos Pueblo made it economically feasible to keep their small farms. So we spent about 2 months working in fields, making friends, interviewing people, and camping. So you can imagine that it was a bit of a shock a couple months later when I was in a suit standing in the top floor of one of the highest skyscrapers in Chicago, getting interviewed for one of the most prestigious academic scholarships in the world to go study sustainability, culture, and development at several of the top universities in England. So I was given the Marshall Scholarship, which was great. But, sorry. So obviously questions have played a very important role in my life. But what I want to emphasize is that when I was pursuing these questions through research and through travel, I didn't know where these questions were taking me. And I think that this might be precisely the reason why they have taken me somewhere. As a student, it's very easy to become diploma-oriented and not question-oriented. It's very easy, It's very easy to let education become a means to an end and to gain a tunnel vision that carries you right past all of the questions that are actually real and relevant to your life and that will actually lead you places. And I think that this question orientation, I think that it's not so much a strategy as it is a lifestyle. I still don't know exactly where I'm going, but I have a general direction. And this just reminds me of this morning that I woke up in the mountains in southwest Mexico. And I looked at my brother, and we both just realized that we were very lost. We had no idea where we were. But it was okay because we had what we needed, and we knew that whichever road we went down, we would meet wonderful people. There would be fresh, tasty tortillas, and there would probably be a beautiful sunset that evening. All we had to do is keep heading south. Thank you.